Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Christine Bishara doing yet another interview with HG Tudor, a diagnosed narcissistic psychopath. I will continue doing these interviews with him because I feel his information is extremely enlightening and important for everyone to know. So HG, thank you once again for joining me. Really looking forward to this interview.
Most welcome, Christine. Thank you for inviting me on again.
Awesome. So let's get started. So my first question for you, the last interview that we did, we talked a little bit about parental narcissists. I wanted to kind of touch upon that again.
Yes.
You know, there's been some evidence that show that sons of narcissistic mothers are more likely to become narcissists than daughters of narcissistic mothers. And I'm assuming that's probably due to the way that mothers treat, narcissistic mothers treat their sons, which is to idolize them, put them on this pedestal, versus daughters where there's more of a competition type of relationship. So I'd love for you to give me a little bit of feedback and your knowledge on that.
Well, you referenced some findings. What are those findings?
Just some studies. I mean, obviously, narcissism is a little bit more common in males, although with your borderline theory, maybe not. But you know, they reference that because the son is idolized, right, and put on this pedestal, but obviously the narcissistic mother is unpredictable in her actions. So there's like an off and on kind of thing. And then when the son becomes a little bit older, goes through puberty, it's his time to break away kind of and become independent. And then there's a little bit of animosity. So apparently that scenario kind of, I don't know, fosters this narcissistic, I guess, predisposition in males from what I've read. I don't know if you're familiar with that or if that's something that you've seen.
Well, I haven't seen anything. Well, that's not to say it exists. You've seen it, I haven't. So it's a little bit difficult for me to comment on it. Apart from, so the hypothesis is that where the mother is a narcissist, the son is more likely to become a narcissist compared to a daughter. Is that it? Yeah,
because apparently a narcissistic mother will treat the son differently than a narcissistic mother will treat the daughter, where there's more competition and, you know, just kind of requiring of this perfectionism, and the daughter can never be good enough. Whereas apparently when it's a narcissistic mother and son dynamic, there's more of a idealization, but then obviously that doesn't last, you know, for long. So I don't know.
Well, as you know from what I've explained previously, Christy, first of all, the offspring would need to have that genetic predisposition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it can be the case that son has it, daughter hasn't. So that's our determining factor, not the treatment of them.
Okay.
But the simple passing on of the genetics. So there's that side of things. But let's assume that they both have the genetic predisposition. Now, son, as you explain, is idolized more by he's the golden child. But that also means that there's a chance, therefore, daughter becomes scapegoat. She's blamed. Why can't you be more like your brother? Oh, your brother achieved this. You know, your brother was walking when he was 9 months old, and you were 14 months before you walked, etc., etc. Now, the issue there, though, is this. Those are both lack of control environments. For son, treated as golden child, he has the gilded existence. Everything's given to him without any effort, and he has no real control over the decisions that he's going to be making. And therefore, that contributes to a lack of control environment. The daughter is similarly in a lack of control environment because she isn't given the emotional support that she should have. She's blamed for things that she's not done. And therefore, both of them would be subjected to a lack of control environment. And therefore, assuming that they both got the genetic predisposition and they're both being exposed to a lack of control environment, it actually would support that they both ought to be narcissists. And I suspect one of the factors that might have some influence on this outcome, and as I say, I haven't seen any material to this extent and be quite interested to see it, thinking it through, that if it is correct that in those scenarios, it's more likely that the son becomes a narcissist than the daughter does, I think this would be down to the fact of an intervener. And so what happens is the father, assuming he is not a narcissist, forms the view, well, he's a boy, he can look out for himself, and he's a bit of a mummy's boy, so I'll just let them get on with it. And what is there really for me to protect? Okay, he's held up as a shining example of being wonderful, and sure, she dotes on him, but at the end of the day, father might not really see that as too much as a problem. Oh, you spoil that boy, etc. Whereas the father's more likely to step in and defend his daughter. Well, you're always giving her a hard time. You favor our son more than her, and that's not fair. So father may then overcompensate with regard to looking after the daughter, shielding her from the worst of the behaviors of the narcissist mother, meaning that lack of control environment doesn't impact upon her. So in effect, son is left to the devices as a mother, therefore has a lack of control environment by being exposed to a gilded life. Daughter has a touch of a lack of control environment because she's scapegoated, but dad steps in to shield her, thus she doesn't become a narcissist. So that could be an explanation for the discrepancy that you've come across.
That's actually a really good point. I wanted to ask you another question regarding that. So do you think, so empaths are kind of made from also the same, right? There's that genetic predisposition and the lack of a control environment. So have you seen that where like a narcissistic mother produces more of an empathic daughter? Just because for whatever you mentioned with the intervener or other circumstances that kind of play a role, does that kind of push the daughter to be more of an empath, or not necessarily from what you've seen?
Well, the empath,
hypothesizing, by the way, yeah.
The empath doesn't have a lack of control environment. If there is one, that has an impact upon the type of empath that they may well be.
Okay.
So what you can have is you could have two normal or two empathic parents, or an empath and a normal, and they have an empathic child. Okay, yeah. There's no lack of control environment there, and so they have an empathic child. You can have narcissist and empath together, and they have an empathic child. Now, remember, the addiction that the empath has comes from either their status as an empath per se, and can also be as a consequence of imprinting, i.e. being exposed to that lack of control environment. So that sort of doubles down on it. Yeah. So what you can have is, take, for example, my own family. I'm a narcissistic psychopath. My sister is an empath. My brother is an empath. My half-brother is a normal.
Okay.
My deceased father is an empath. My, unfortunately, still living mother is a narcissist. So her genetic predisposition was passed down to me, and I was subjected to a lack of control environment. Thus, I became what I became. And I didn't have an intervener. I was shielded because, the reasons best known to him, my father thought that I could manage. I think he essentially recognized there was something different about me, and therefore it would enable me to cope more effectively. Or that he felt that because I was the elder of the three of us, the eldest of the three of us, because my half-brother, he is the eldest, but he wasn't really around the family that much. Okay. He perhaps thought that I was in a better position to sort of look after myself, and that he felt with my sister and brother being younger than me, he perhaps also, I don't know, felt that he needed to shield them more than he needed to shield me, or he just didn't have enough coping mechanisms to see to all three of us, and I lost out. And so they may well have had the genetic predisposition from my mother, but because of my father's behavior, he shielded them from the worst of the lack of control environment, and they became empaths. But they're also exposed to some of her behaviors which forged the addiction to the narcissist, or the genetic predisposition didn't hit with them and they were shielded from the lack of control environment, which meant furthermore that they obviously didn't become narcissists. So you have all of these various permutations that can occur.
It's very interesting. And you being the oldest child, I was actually going to ask you that question, but you kind of touched upon it. But you being the oldest child, Is there more likelihood of a narcissistic mother putting the oldest child as the golden child and putting them on that pedestal and kind of predisposing them a little bit more to that lack of control environment? I know you mentioned your dad was an intervener, but I'm just curious if you think the role of you being the oldest and kind of being—
Well, I wasn't the golden child.
Okay.
What I was exposed to was physical and sexual and emotional abuse, but also what I call grade B syndrome, where my mother expected great things of me. And as a consequence of that, I was always pushed, and I was never given any genuine praise for what I achieved. It was, well, so you should. That's expected of you. So no matter how much I excelled academically, at sport, at music, at my hobbies, my various interests, it was always met with
never good enough, right?
Yeah, never good enough. So I was never doted and praised. I know, although I never witnessed this directly, I know from what other people said that outwardly, as part of her facade, she would sing my praises because, of course, I was a little extension of her. So it was always the case of, oh, our HG scored X number of goals, or our HG came top of his class, our HG did this, our HG did that. And she triangulated other people with my success because it was her success.
Right.
In her world, she saw that she was the one that enabled me to do all of those things. In actual fact, it was more to do with my innate ability. And if anybody would deserve any form of credit, it would be my father. Rather than her, because she was a very aloof and distant parent. I think her view was that given the fact that she taught us to sit straight at the dining table, we knew how to use a fork and appropriate cutlery and all things like that, that was sufficient. So I wasn't a golden child internally. Externally, I was, but that wouldn't have an impact on me because I didn't actually witness it. But I think in certain instances, anecdotally, it follows that a lot of the time the eldest child may well be allocated the role of golden child. There will always be exceptions to that, but I think it's the case of that because they're special, they're the first one, they're new and exciting and shiny. Right. And I know from discussions that I've had with people who don't allocate a role at all of a golden child. But when it was, for instance, I've spoken to friends who are mothers, and they've talked about how, with their first child, it was, oh, goodness me, and getting everything right, and it was all new and exciting. Whereas when the second one, and it was that second child, was loved just as much, but they were far more relaxed about the pregnancy. They were far more relaxed about giving birth. It was like, yeah, been here, done that. So it's marvelous in its own way, as I've heard them explain, but it doesn't have the same magic. So you can imagine that with the narcissist, and remember, narcissists do suffer to some extent of getting bored. And so when the first child comes along, this is new and it's shiny, it's interesting and exciting. So dote. Yeah. Then the second and the third and the fourth comes along. I'm not really as interested in these kid things anymore. So there's a possibility that because of the status of being unique and new at that juncture, the eldest child may well become the golden child for those reasons, and the second, third, and fourth born children don't. As I say, there are differences. I know of some of that myself in other dynamics with my family and people that I know. But as a general proposition, I think that would hold up as being sensible.
Yeah. You make a lot of really interesting points actually about that. And like whether or not parents are narcissists or not, there has been like proof that they say that the oldest child of a family is usually the most successful, and they attribute that to the fact that exactly what you said, they're doted on. Parents, put more effort into whatever it is, tutoring or taking them to here and here, and then it kind of just wears off, right? So yeah, I mean, that actually makes sense. I'm curious what kind of narcissist your mom is. Is she aware?
Upper mid-range. No, she's unaware.
Upper range. Okay. And have you ever had the conversation with her where you try to tell her, or it goes right through?
No, that's pointless.
Yeah. Okay. So did your mom, I guess I'm assuming she maintained like an external facade where things look peachy keen outside the house and not inside?
Exactly. Well, externally, we were seen as a successful family, well known in the community.
Yeah.
Pretty well off, one would say, wealthy. Excuse me. And she was known. She was certainly known when she was more active that you were not to get on the wrong side of her, as you would be socially frozen out.
Mm-hmm.
So she was known to have that side to her, but generally was seen as a very good organizer, took a keen interest in a lot of sort of community-based events, sat on committees and so forth.
Yeah.
Some might say busybody. And that external facade was one of success, but also doing good, but not a do-gooder, because she wasn't the type to sort of helicopter around people. So she wouldn't be there crocheting around the clock and baking until she was covered in flour. She would be telling other people to do that. So she was the commander of it all. So she would get people together and say, right, Gertrude, you're making the muffins. Florence, you're on flour arranging, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine a battalion of Women's Institute members rolling out with their charitable activities, with all being orchestrated by my mother. Mm-hmm. And so it's similar with the charitable trust that she was involved in. You wouldn't find her down at the soup kitchen, but she would be the one cozying up to people at various events and sort of glad-handing and saying, right now, Cedric, about that donation you're going to give us. Come on, you're not getting away from me. And she had a degree, certainly had a degree of charisma, because in her heyday, she was an attractive woman. Yeah. And so she certainly gained attention, both she was intelligent and well-spoken, and she could handle herself in many social situations. She certainly was able to sort of carry the room when she dealt with people. So she was very effective, but as you know, it was because it was all simply about her. So it was all done to ensure that she looked good. And of course, behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. And all of these people had no idea what was going on at Chateau Tudor.
Huh. And what was the dynamic between your mom and your dad, him being an empath? Did they stay together until he passed away?
Yes, he was very much, he was somewhat in awe of her, both in terms of the abilities. I mean, he was no slouch himself, but he spent a lot of his time sort of running around and kowtowing to her because he'd been on the receiving end of her fury. Also, there was a double act between my mother and my uncle, her brother, who is also a narcissist. And basically, he would regularly embarrass my father, who would get no support from my mother. In fact, she would crow in a somewhat incestuous way about her brother. And I think with my father, he was a solid and dependable individual, clearly kind, with his emotional empathy. And he got sucked into this relationship with, if you looked at them, you would say that he was punching above his weight. And therefore, there was a bit, he was, in a sense, swept off his feet through the usual love bombing that occurs. So he thought, in a way, goodness me, I've done rather well marrying into this family. She's a looker, she's intelligent, she's articulate, she's really well connected. Right. And then, of course,
bam,
he was then he gets devalued. There's already a child, which he takes on. Then I come along, and thereafter he finds himself enmeshed. And of course, not really knowing what he's dealing with, he then reverts to trying to sort it out and thinking he must have done something wrong, because after all, there's this woman that's so highly thought of by everybody else. Right. Surely then it must be him that's the problem. Typical response of an empath that's affected by the manipulations and blinded by the emotional thinking. So as I understand it from what I've pieced together from what I've seen and what I've heard from other family members, piecing the puzzle together, that he spent most of his time trying to facilitate her, trying to appease her, trying to placate her, rather than thinking, actually, I'm being abused and I should go. And then it shifted, of course, when my younger siblings came along, that he very much was there to shield and protect them. Mm-hmm. And I think he was just content when things were quiet and she wasn't kicking up a storm in some respect.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to redirect all my questions now because this is much more fascinating. So I had a couple of questions that came up while you were speaking about that. So you had mentioned your mother and her brother, both narcissists, had this incestuous relationship. I'm assuming you're talking figuratively, right? Or literally? No. Okay.
It's literally.
Okay. Well, I'm curious because I've also noticed that like narcissistic mothers and their sons or narcissistic siblings have this odd relationship where there's like this figurative incestuous relationship. They're very enmeshed in each other's lives and get along really well. Like have you seen that? And what is that?
Well, well, with the two of them, they are different types of narcissists, but of course, neither has any boundary recognition. They both function with a sense of entitlement. And there have been times where they have clashed.
Yeah.
So what has happened, my uncle is upper lesser type B, so he's a bully, he's brash, he's a very successful man, but he operates without any facade whatsoever. And if you read my book, Fury, that'll tell you more about some of his behaviors. So what would happen, there would be instances where he would explode. And my mother's response was to turn on an icy heel and march away. So he thought that he got control over her because he'd lambasted her, a lot of the time criticizing her in terms of my father and saying, you know, he's weak and what are you doing with him? Almost in a way saying, you should have been with me, which clearly she couldn't have been. But in his world, he wouldn't differentiate, you see. And he's always regarded his sister as possession. Similarly, she's always been always praising him because of the level of wealth and success that he's achieved. And then when he blows up like this, her reaction to it is to basically say to him, oh, he's having one of his tantrums because although he's successful, he isn't as intelligent as she is. So the way that she rationalizes it is to basically say, I'm not dealing with this. So because it's her decision not to deal with it, she then gains that sense of control through withdrawal. And she basically says, he's having one of his tantrums, I'm leaving him to it. And so she will retreat from it. But when they're together and there isn't any response of heated fury or cold fury, it's like you would, if you didn't know who they were, you would think that they were a couple. They're overly tactile. They have in-jokes between them. And the way that they go on is often they're sort of sat almost in cahoots, a conspiratorial duo discussing things. And invariably it would be the case that people who perhaps didn't know the family would be surprised to find my father suddenly appear and realize that he was married to my mother. They thought he was the help that was there waiting on, because he was scurrying around fixing drinks for people and bringing, the canapes through, being barked at with orders by his brother-in-law and his wife. And so that was the way this was gone on. And it's certainly the case that there's been sexual activity between the two of them.
It's fascinating. That kind of also makes me wonder, which is one of my other questions relating to this. So you mentioned that empaths are easier prey and narcissists seek them out as spouses or partners because of the fact that they're more able to cater to the prime aims. So, now that you're speaking about your mother and her brother, I'd love for you to talk about two narcissists that are married. I mean, you would think, both of them are kind of fighting for that control and they're going to get divorced pretty quickly, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Like when two narcissists get married, what's the dynamic there, number one? And also, are there specific types of narcissists that will last longer in a marriage based on, the different ways that they interact?
Yes. So I started a series when narcissists collide, explaining how certain types of narcissists fit together, both in terms of romantic, social, familial interactions. And it's a series that I really ought to conclude, because I get asked about the other permutations that exist. So in some instances, certain subschools will come together and it really is a collision, and it's short-lived. They basically explode and it erupts and it all ends in tears before bedtime.
Is that usually two lessers?
That would invariably be the case, yeah. So you would also have some which are turbulent, but enduring, but not forever.
Yeah.
Where you might get, for instance, a successful upper lesser type B with a mid-ranger. And utilizing the example I just gave you of my, let us assume that my uncle and my mother were a married couple, that their dynamic would be, there'd be instances where they were in cahoots against other people, but they would repeatedly clash with one another. But they'd both be able to feel that they had a sense of control, because when he erupted and she retreated, his narcissism subconsciously told him, you're in control because she ran away from you. Right. Her narcissism tells her, you chose to withdraw from this oath. You're in control. So in those instances where you might say have an upper lesser type B and upper mid-ranger, they have a shared advantage of the pursuit of success, and they're both able to achieve that, but they have a turbulent relationship, which sometimes other people would see as well. Mm-hmm. So you would have that type of dynamic, and what I need to do is complete by doing the videos and blog articles, by going through all the permutations for people. But there's also something called narcissistic cementation, which I am going to be doing a video on this, so I'm not going to go into great detail about it now, because I want to save my powder in that respect. But narcissistic cementation is essentially where two narcissists come together and their narcissism recognizes that the sum of the whole is greater than the parts, i.e. that whilst there will be issues of control, that what can be achieved by the two of them sticking together is much improved. And in some instances, that will accord whereby control is given in circumstances. So, for example, let's take a husband and wife, both narcissists, and she consents to him taking a mistress. So a good example of that is House of Cards. And you obviously have the American version, but it was based on the British version, which had Francis Urquhart, played by Ian Richardson. Fantastic performance. And he took under his wing Mattie Storin, a journalist. Now, Urquhart's wife knew that he was going to conduct an affair, because basically he explained to her that in order to advance his political aims and ambitions, he needed to have an on-side journalist that would write favorably, that would also smear his opponents and could provide him with information. And the most effective way of doing that would be to manipulate that journalist into doing what he wanted by virtue of fulfilling a sort of daddy role for her. And in order to maintain control over his wife, he basically explained to her that there was a way of dealing with this journalist which would necessitate him having a sexual relationship with her. And his wife, also a narcissist, recognized that the advantage to the Urquhart ambition would be to allow him to do that. And so a narcissist can have control by agreement. So her narcissism, ordinarily you think, well, if he's going to have an affair with someone outside of the marriage, that's going to stretch your control. Not if her narcissism recognizes that it would be advantageous for her to consent to it, so that then he would gain access to things which would benefit the two of them. And so in the circumstances, her narcissism dictates her, the wife, to go, well, okay, and basically don't rub my nose in it, don't get caught, don't do anything foolish. And so where she agrees that he may go and do this, that gives her a sense of control. And of course, because she has agreed that he may go and have an affair, he also has control. Mm-hmm. And those two narcissists have both got the control that they need, and their respective narcissism recognizes that it enables something bigger to be built. So they cement their ambitions. So Bill and Hillary Clinton are another good example of how that occurs. Now, in House of Cards, Francis Urquhart was an aware narcissist. So he was very much a Machiavellian individual, knew what he was, and therefore he knew that it would be appropriate, rather than to go and do it behind his wife's back, but he had the, if you like, the balls to say to his wife, he didn't come out with it in the sense of, look, I'm going to start banging 7 bells out of, you know, this young, tidy journalist. But basically, I see that the most effective way to get her to be where we want to be is to be intimate with her. So he didn't rub his wife's face in it, and she knew what he was driving at, and it was basically, you have my permission. So he knew that the best way to get her to agree to what he wanted was to frame it in those terms. So there are instances where a relationship will endure because the narcissism recognizes that the totality of that relationship and what it will achieve is one that benefits both of them, rather than, it invariably involves an aware narcissist, because they have their eye on what the future is. And so an unaware narcissist would perhaps think, right, I need to get this journalist under my control, or the narcissism thinks, I'll get this journalist under control by sleeping with her, but doesn't tell the wife, who is also a narcissist, who then finds out that he's been cheating, and boom, it erupts. So it's invariably where the cementation takes place. You have an aware narcissist in the mix. So you do have enduring relationships between two narcissists along the lines that I've explained. It doesn't mean that it's a happy union, and but they gain what they both require. They will both get fuel. They'll both get control. They'll both get character traits and residual benefits. And the, if you like, explosive aspect of the interaction between them is less likely for the reasons that I've explained.
And it's more like negative fuel for the other, right? Those explosive outbursts, right?
Well, it will be, and where there is that particular response that takes place. So, for instance, if let's say you've got an upper lesser A who is in a relationship with a middle range type A, so he is charismatic, totally superficial, the affable arsehole, and he's sleeping with people left, right, and center. She then finds out, and although heated fury is not the go-to, it will still can occur with a middle range type A.
Yeah.
So behind closed doors, she doesn't tear a strip off him in public. Facade says mustn't do that. But behind closed doors, what the hell do you think you're doing out? You've embarrassed me. You've made a fool of me. They're all talking about the fact that you've been sleeping with these 5 women down at the tennis club, etc. You're an arsehole. I hate you. And of course, her eruption, that negative fuel, the anger is negative fuel, albeit it is challenge fuel because she's criticizing him, and he would have to do something to respond to that in order to try and get control over her.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, actually. Very, very interesting. I had another question about that, and now I forgot. Okay, doesn't matter. Oh, you know, yeah, I was going to ask you. Can two mid-rangers also stay kind of enmeshed, both kind of this passive-aggressive facade? And
they could do. What would tend to happen is that there would be, it would be a good place for refrigeration, because there would be a lot of cold fury going on, where they would both basically retreat from one another. I'm not talking to him. I'm not talking to her. Lots of silences, cold shoulders, glaring, etc. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, I remember what I wanted to say. You know, when you were talking about House of Cards, there's so many couples in the public eye that I think are very similar to that. where they maintain this facade, but they think there's this control. I mean, I'm thinking of one, I get, you would call him a holy narcissist in the news.
Okay.
And the wife, they found out the wife was cheating, but the man that she was cheating with, he said he knew all about it. He was in on it. So it's really interesting that you say that.
So there is some, see, to many people, the concept of your spouse having sexual intimacy with somebody else is an absolute no-no. You know, even where people might say, you know, hey, let's have a threesome. The other person will go, no, not at all, no. And invariably, even where that does happen, there's always one party that's keener on it than the other. And what tends to happen, of course, is that so people find that absolutely abhorrent. But to a narcissist, because everything is in play, some narcissists, of course, if they're cheated on, it's the end of the world because it's huge stretch of control. But to other narcissists, it's simply, if my narcissism dictates that I think it's sensible for my spouse to go and sleep with somebody else because that gives me an alternative gain, so what? The narcissist is able to do it. Why? Because they don't actually care about their partner.
Right.
There's no emotional empathy.